At the Nocturnists, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Welcome back to the Nocturnists, Post-Roe America. I'm Dr. Allie Block.
I was in the middle taking care of patients in the ICU.
And the question of abortion has been returned to the states.
Overturned Roe v. Wade.
As soon as I heard it, I continued on with doing the work. But obviously, I didn't realize the effect it actually had taken on me until one of my colleagues said, "Did I do something to upset you? Are you okay because you're acting in a manner that you normally don't act?" And I didn't realize it was that apparent on my face. I remember thinking, how could you not be this angry? How could you not know this is what I'm actually angry about? And I had to say to my colleague, who's a really nice male physician I work with, it's not you at all. It's a fact that we just lost rights as women. And he looked at me, I think he understood what I was talking about, but he didn't really know what to say about it. Nobody else seemed to be talking about this. The nurses, respiratory therapists, or the physicians. The isolation of it, with looking back now, I think made me even more angry. Like, how are we not stopping everything to just acknowledge it for a minute and say, oh my God, how do we prepare this? And how do we approach this? Or how do we acknowledge it? We just weren't.
When I first heard this story from Vineesha, I was struck by how different her experience of the Dobbs Day was from mine. I remember people around me were crying, making phone calls, texting. Everyone was talking about it, and everyone seemed to be on the same page, that this was a big deal. Part of that is because of where we each worked at the time. I was in San Francisco, and Vineesha was in an ICU in rural Tennessee. But there's something else. Something we've been talking about as a team that we're going to explore in today's episode. It's the idea of the culture of silence that surrounds abortion. Abortion is taboo. We don't talk about it, even in healthcare spaces. But it can be more subtle than that. For example, even in the San Francisco Bay Area, where it seemed everyone was on the same team, the day the Dobbs decision went down, I remember wondering, could things have been different if we had been louder, sooner? Of course, there are so many people who've been outspoken and doing incredible work championing abortion rights. But many more of us have been quiet. Today, we examine the culture of silence, both within the field of abortion care and beyond, in the broader world of healthcare. What's behind the silence? And what are the costs, both to the status of abortion rights, but also on healthcare workers at an individual level? What does it mean to not talk about this very basic aspect of healthcare? To start, let me introduce Emily Patel.
I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. My family has lived here for decades, so Nebraska is definitely home.
Emily stayed in the state for both undergrad and med school before heading to North Carolina for her maternal fetal medicine fellowship at Duke. Soon after she finished, she headed back to Omaha. For Emily, abortion was never a central part of her pull towards medicine.
For maternal fetal medicine, it is not a specific part of our training. That being said, there are situations as a maternal fetal medicine specialist where knowing how to do an abortion procedure is incredibly important. And I understood that. So during my training as a specialist, I opted to get additional training so I knew how to do that type of procedure. And now I'm one of only a couple of people in our state who can provide that service.
Had she not moved back home, Emily would likely rarely have put that training to use. There were so many other providers at Duke who offered that kind of care already. But when she found herself back in Nebraska, she discovered that if she didn't provide D&Es for patients with miscarriage or life-threatening complications, there were very few other providers who could. So it was a pragmatic decision, not a political one.
I mean, honestly, in my mind at that time, things were pretty unremarkable. The access to abortion when absolutely needed was there. I wasn't really thinking about it. And maybe that's the problem. You know?
In 2020, the Nebraska state legislature made a move to tighten up abortion restrictions. They introduced a bill that would ban D&Es, the most common surgical procedure used in second trimester abortions.
I specifically remember a phone call that I got from one of my colleagues, and she comes from a political family. So she has kind of been ingrained in politics, but she's also an OBGYN. And it's like seared in my brain. I still remember it very vividly. She said, this bill is a slippery slope. Like, this is one thing, but they're going to start presenting more things. And I'm wondering, would you be willing to either come down and testify in person or write a letter? And she said, listen, Emily, I recognize that you recently moved back here. You're just kind of getting your feet wet in your career. You've got 2 young kids and a family, and this is a very divisive topic, abortion. I understand if you don't want to put your name out there. Like, it can be very scary. You hear about these cases where, I mean, it was just in Wichita, Kansas, where, Tiller was killed, an abortion provider. Plant bombs at Planned Parenthoods or get shot in their homes. And most of what happens is stuff like on social media where people just get taken down and nasty things said about them. And that's one thing, but I think the thing that was very scary to us was the thought of any kind of actual physical violence or something like that. And so I talked to my husband about it, and he was like, I'm nervous about it. I'm scared for your safety. I'm scared for our family. And I'd really prefer that you not put your name to it. And so I wrote a letter in opposition, and I wrote it anonymously, and I sent it in. And on some level, looking back on it now feels a little shameful, but it was the decision that we thought was best at that time. And it's evolved. Yeah.
This mindset of keeping your head down, avoiding conflict, Emily says it's how she got through her medical training. And this is really common and something that comes up a lot on this show. Like, there was this time during her training that a superior threw forceps at her in the operating room for making a small mistake.
I remember going home that night and crying and telling my husband about this incident. He's like, you have to report that. Like, you have to take it to the higher ups. And I was like, I can't do that. Like, I'm a resident. Like, what if I get fired? What if they reprimand me? What if they retaliate against me? I was like, no, I'm just going to mind my business, do my work, go home, and I'm not going to say anything.
So that was her MO. And it kept her out of trouble in medical school, residency, and fellowship, and in her early career. But in 2022, news of the Dobbs decision made it feel like that MO was no longer an option.
I was getting up to go see a patient, and I got a text message. It was on my watch. I was like holding back tears when I walked in to go see this patient, saw the patient, got out of there, and went back to my office, and I cried. It was within a few days. We met in one of our friends' basements and talked about what we think we need to do. Like, what can we do? And the idea that sprouted from that was to form this political action committee. And I was like, okay, well, this is the moment. Like, this is it. It's now or never. I think I'm just going to have to put myself out there. And so it's like my husband and I sat down and had that same conversation again. And I don't think that there was anything in our hearts that had changed with regard to how we felt about it. I think it was just the sheer fact of this is a humanitarian crisis. Like, this is not right. This is unethical. This has become bigger than me. And of course, I still think about my family. Of course, I still think about my kids and their safety. Yeah. It was hard. And then once we jumped off into the deep end, it was like, all right, well, we're here now. So might as well go full board, It wasn't like a baby steps. It was like a belly flop into the deep end.
Within the first year, Emily and her colleagues raised over $400,000 for targeted spending on key legislative races. They testified at numerous congressional hearings and successfully lobbied to have the Nebraska Medical Association, the most powerful medical group in Nebraska politics, commit to opposing any new anti-abortion legislation. At the same time, the Nebraska legislature tried to pass a 6-week ban. It failed, but they ultimately managed to pass a 12-week one, replacing the pre-Dobbs 20-week limit. So there were some wins and some losses. Throughout it all, Emily said, the community was where she found the light she needed to keep going.
I mean, Nebraska is not a huge place, and Omaha is a pretty small community, especially in the medical community. It's not hard to find those people and gravitate towards them. I mean, these people have been more than just my allies in this. They've become some of my closest friends, absolutely. Hands down. I feel like I could tell any of them anything. So out of terrible things sometimes comes, good things as well. We've got a group text chain. So by the time I get off of my phone call with you guys, there'll probably be about like 40 unread messages. So there are a lot of physicians who are incredibly supportive, but are not willing to put their name out. And I have to respect that because I have been there. And I think it's hard to really be thrust into something when you're not ready. And I think once I just kind of dove in, I was like, okay, this feels way more authentic to who I am, I think, in my heart. I feel lighter in doing so. It feels like a weight off. I'm over 40 years old now, and I feel like in the last year I've stepped into what my life should look like. Like, this is what I should be doing.
So how do we weigh the moral, emotional, and political costs of remaining silent while balancing the real fears and all too often real consequences of speaking out? To look at this question from another angle, we talked to Caitlin Bernard, an OBGYN and abortion provider in Indianapolis. Soon after the Dobbs decision, the fears that Emily Patel had about initially becoming involved in advocacy work became a reality for Caitlin when she found herself on the pointy end of the anti-abortion movement's political spearhead.
For me, medicine and advocacy are totally interchangeably related and unable to be really separated.
That's not the case for everyone, Caitlin acknowledges, but for her, it's just always made sense that way.
I mean, my parents are like classic hippies, I was born on a commune, and so the idea of community support was just a part of the way that I grew up.
This ethos of community support, the question of how she could meaningfully contribute to those around her, was what initially led Caitlin to medicine. During her OBGYN fellowship in St. Louis, she studied under longtime abortion advocate Colleen McNicholas. And in between clinical rotations, she started going with Colleen to the State House regularly to testify on pieces of legislation.
We knew that these pieces of legislation were going to pass. Like, in terms of the legislative process and what happened, makes no difference whether we're in these state houses because they're just going to do whatever they want. I could tell them the worst, most horrible story, all of the evidence that shows that this is insane. They do not care. But I really felt like, if nobody was there in that room, then who was representing all of us physicians? Who was representing all of the patients who had obtained abortions or would need to obtain abortions? So it kind of really made me feel like, okay, every single bill that's out here, we need to at least just go and testify for.
So that's what she did. By 2019, Caitlin was living and working in Indianapolis. That year, a proposal was brought to the legislature that would ban D&Es. She went to the State House and testified against it.
I was very pregnant when I testified against it. I think I was like 36 weeks or something like that. And then it passed. And then a couple weeks after I delivered, I got a call from the ACLU and they said, do you want to challenge the suit?
At that point, there was only one other abortion provider who did D&Es in the state. And both Caitlin and the ACLU lawyers were pretty sure he wasn't the type to testify.
You know, drives a different way to work every day, sleeps in the hospital so that people won't trace him back to his home, doesn't do anything publicly, you know, would never say in public, I'm an abortion provider, would never testify in the legislature, much less like be a plaintiff. And the suit can only be brought by somebody who is personally affected by it, right? Like, it's not like some random person can be like, I don't think D&Es should be illegal. But I could, because I do them, and it would create an undue burden for my patients because it would force them to undergo, for example, induction of labor instead of a D&E. So then the ACLU lawyers, who I obviously am very good friends with now, came to my house when I was like 6 weeks postpartum, and we started the lawsuit. It was like this tiny little basement room right in the State House. And the room was just like packed and it was so hot. And I had my white coat because we always wear that, you know, when we go testify. So I'm like sweating like crazy. And the room is packed with these college kids, like the next generation for life, you know, and they're all wearing their t-shirts. And I'm just like staring at them and I'm just like, you have no fucking idea about anything. How could you possibly have anything to say about this that would provide any helpful information for these legislators to make any decision? And then on the other side was a young woman, you know, young, blonde, and she held up her ultrasound picture of her twins. And she's like, I am pregnant right now, and, you know, yada, 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 about how horrible D&Es are. She ended up working in the Attorney General's office, you know, surprise, surprise.
Caitlin testified from her clinical perspective. She talked about all the situations when D&Es are critical, often life-saving procedures. If someone's hemorrhaging or if they have a life-threatening condition, she talked about the actual science of fetal pain. But she said it felt like no one was listening. The bill passed later that month.
Now to the latest battleground in the fight over abortion rights. This was the scene in Indiana State House as lawmakers there considered a near total ban. CBS Evening News.
Soon after the Dobbs decision, the state of Indiana started talking about passing a near total ban on abortion. But they didn't make a decision. 3 days later, on June 27, 2022, Caitlin received a call from a child abuse doctor in Ohio. He had a 10-year-old patient who was 6 weeks and 3 days pregnant. Because of a trigger ban that had gone into effect in Ohio hours after the Dobbs ruling, the patient was unable to receive an abortion in her home state. Caitlin performed the abortion days later in Indiana, where it was still legal up to 12 weeks. Soon after, she went to an anti-abortion rally, where a reporter from the Indianapolis Star overheard a conversation she was having with another doctor and asked for comment. Caitlin shared that in the previous days, she had performed an abortion on a 10-year-old from Ohio who was unable to access care. The story rapidly became national news.
Senator Nora O'Donnell sat down with someone who's become a symbol of this debate. That's Dr. Caitlin Bernard, who's an OBGYN in Indiana, who, according to state records obtained by CBS News, provided a medication abortion to a 10-year-old rape victim from neighboring Ohio. That's
part of the initial retaliatory statement about me was that I am an activist, right? So I was an activist acting like a doctor.
That statement came from Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita. She's lying, he suggested. There's no way Caitlin was telling the truth, that there weren't any 10-year-olds in need of abortions, that she was just an activist trying to manipulate people into sympathizing with her pro-abortion agenda. At first, Caitlin wasn't worried.
I mean, the biggest thing that I remember from that whole experience was just like, how could people not know that like little girls get raped and pregnant? Like, how could they not know that this was literally like the natural course of an abortion ban? I felt less concerned about my own personal, retribution, like crazy people calling me or something like that. It didn't occur to me. It was much more of like, I just don't understand how they could not realize what was going to happen.
But as time progressed, Rokita's tactics evolved.
Attorney General Todd Rokita alleges that Dr. Bernard broke the law. He alleges that she violated patient privacy laws by sharing that story with the Indianapolis Star, and he alleges that she failed to report the abuse of that child. Those are allegations she and her legal team deny.
Caitlin's story was bad press for the anti-abortion agenda. And because the abortion that she'd performed was still legal, Todd Rokita had to find a different way to take her down. So he came after her medical license. In an unprecedented move, he brought charges against her to the state medical licensing board. He suggested that she had failed to report the instance of child abuse to the proper authorities, despite the fact that there was official documentation proving otherwise. And he suggested that she had broken privacy laws when she shared the age and home state of her patient with the Indy Star. All of a sudden, Caitlin was facing the real possibility of thousands of dollars of fines and losing her medical license, all for having talked about performing a legal abortion.
So at the beginning of the hearing, they had to go through these procedural processes. And one of them is that they wanted to force me to answer the questions about my tattoo, which is of a hanger. And so the first 20 minutes of the hearing with everybody in the room, all the cameras, everything was we want to force her to answer these questions about her tattoo. And so there was this back and forth about, well, what is the tattoo? And what does it say? And why would that be relevant? And how is this important? And so fucking bizarre. And then to the right is 20 cameras just trained on me. This wasn't an administrative process, right? It was really just a personal attack.
It wasn't just the personal nature of the attacks that set this hearing apart. It was the legal tactics, too, that were unlike any medical board hearing Caitlin had ever heard of.
Literally, they used our taxpayer dollars to pay lawyers from Washington, D.C. to come and prosecute me, which is just unheard of in a medical licensing board hearing. It just felt like, the government of my state is against me.
The hearing lasted 15 hours. A wall of cameras followed Caitlin's every move, filming her testimony, her pauses, even snapping photos of her while she ate an apple during one break. And I can tell you personally, this is every physician's worst nightmare. Being brought in front of a medical board and deemed incompetent or unfit to perform the job you've trained for your whole adult life. In the end, the board unanimously agreed that Caitlin had reported the case to the proper authorities, but they found her guilty of violating privacy laws when she shared the age and home state of the patient, despite the fact that neither of these pieces of information are listed in HIPAA. She got to keep her medical license, but they fined her $3,000 and issued a letter of reprimand. Caitlin's continued working as a clinician this whole time. It's what she would rather be doing, she says, than defending herself against the state. But although she tries not to let the legal mess affect how she shows up with her patients, Indiana's legal and political climate have fundamentally shifted what it means for her to provide reproductive health care.
I mean, already, in literally the last 2 days, it's trying to figure out if somebody will meet our criteria for an abortion in Indiana. I had a patient who called, and in her last pregnancy, during her labor, she ruptured her uterus. Does that count as life-threatening enough that this could happen again to her? Who decides that? Who's going to second guess my medical opinion, the medical opinion of the MFM? What happens if we do her abortion and we put it on the terminated pregnancy report? It gets sent to Indiana Right to Life. They send a complaint to the Attorney General's office. I'm back in a hearing again. On my to-do list is to call my county prosecutor to find out what he's going to do if somebody calls in a complaint against me. And am I going to go to jail? I mean, it's a level 5 felony if I perform an illegal abortion. What does that process look like? You know, my hospital security brought up on like a, you know, planning implementation call for this new law, like, if somebody complains to us, we're a police force, are we supposed to arrest her? Like in her office? Like, how does that work? I was at a conference sometime this spring, I guess, and my mentor and friend Colleen McNicholas said, you know, I gave an advocacy grand rounds at this hospital, and this person stood up and was like, you know, that Caitlin Bernard did everything that you're telling us to do, and look what happened to her. How could we possibly do these things if that's what's going to happen to us? And she was like, I'm sorry, do you know her? Because I know her personally, and I can guarantee that that is the last thing that she wants to come out of this. And it's absolutely true. That is literally would be the worst case scenario. It just allows them to win. That is exactly what they are trying to do. And if that's the lesson that everybody learns from this, then it feels like it was not worth any of that, you know, personal risk. So I would much prefer that the response be like, look, if she can stand up and take all of that risk, then I can do what I need to do in my small space to provide that same level of integrity and good patient care and advocacy. If you leave it to the most visible abortion providers to do all of the advocacy, then yeah, of course we look like activists because you're stranding us in the middle of nowhere by ourselves. If everybody is doing the same thing, non-OBGYNs, non-abortion providers, if we as the medical community could actually finally get on the same page and be upfront and visible and vocal about the fact that abortion is healthcare and a medical procedure like any other medical procedure that exists, then there would be nothing that anybody could say to that because we are the medical establishment.
In the year and a half since Dobbs, Caitlin and countless others have been speaking out, working to break the culture of silence that surrounded abortion care for too long, and fighting to reclaim the rights that Dobbs took away. If you're looking for ways to get involved, check out our website at thenocturnists.com. The Post-Roe America page has an advocacy toolkit with resources to help you get started. Next week, we turn toward the future of abortion care by examining the impacts of the Dobbs decision on medical education. In a country split by vastly different abortion laws, what's it like to be a medical trainee? What's it like to be a reproductive health educator? And what are the ramifications of the current legal landscape on the future providers and their patients? That's next week. The Nocturnists Post-Roe America was created by me, Allie Block, and Emily Silverman. Our lead producer was Molly Rose Williams, and our producers were Sam Osborne and Jessica Young. John Oliver helped with the mixing, and Carly Besser assistant produced. Thanks to medical student producers Anjali Walia, Dahlia Kaki, Fiona Miller, and Milky Mahari, and pre-health intern Treya Tompkins. Our chief operating officer is Rebecca Groves. The series illustrations are by Nicole Zhu. The Nocturnist theme music is by Yosef Monroe, and all additional music comes from Blue Dot Sessions. The Nocturnists Post-Roe America series was made possible in part by the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. The Nocturnist is supported by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure that the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. Our show is also made possible with donations from listeners like you. Thank you for supporting our work in storytelling. If you enjoy our show, please follow us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. You can also help others find us by telling your friends and colleagues, posting this episode on social media, and leaving us a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. To contribute your voice to an upcoming project or to support our work with a donation, visit our website at thenocturnist.com. You can also find resources with more information about the state of abortion in the U.S., as well as ways to advocate and get involved at the series website. I'm your host, Allie Block. See you next week.